Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Mindful Living Summit. And I'm Peter Wang. I'm the CEO of Healthy Minds Innovations, the nonprofit that translates the science from the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin into tools for cultivating and measuring well-being. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Kristin Neff here to discuss self-compassion and how it can increase our resilience and our ability to connect with others. Dr. Neff is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. She really did the first empirical studies on self-compassion over 15 years ago. And in addition to her academic research, she's co-developed an empirically supported training program called Mindful Self-Compassion, which I have personally taken and I would strongly recommend. And is the author of books on self-compassion. She wrote Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself, the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, and Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, a guide for professionals. So thank you for being here with us, Kristin.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Nice to be here.
And so Kristin, we'd love to hear from you, if you wouldn't mind kind of defining mindful self-compassion and how can cultivating it impact us?
Yeah, so, the idea of self-compassion is an ancient idea. I actually learned about self-compassion when I was practicing mindfulness meditation. And the woman leading the course talked about the importance of having compassion for ourselves as well as others. And so, in a simple sense, compassion can just be thought of as treating yourself with the same kindness, care, support to yourself when you're struggling as you would naturally show a good friend. But when I decided I wanted to do research on self-compassion back in about 2001, I think I started, working on it. I realized I needed a little more formal definition of self-compassion because I wanted to create a scale to measure it. So I define self-compassion, as having three main components. The first component is actually mindfulness. There's a lot of talk about mindfulness these days. It's really entered the common culture. But mindfulness is essential to self-compassion. We have to first be able to notice when we're suffering, and be with our pain without immediately trying to fix a problem or blame ourselves for the problem or escape the problem or avoid the problem. We kind of have to hold our own pain in mindful awareness as the first step. And then we need to respond, again, with this kind, caring response like we would show to a good friend, which, easier said than done, because research shows that most of us are actually much harsher to ourselves than we are to others, right? My research shows about at least 70% of people are significantly more harsh with themselves than they are to others. And there's a few different reasons for that we can talk about, but basically it's not compassion unless it has a quality of warmth, of kindness, of care and support. But there's also a third element to self-compassion that's really important and that's actually necessary to distinguish it from self-pity. And that's recognition of common humanity or interconnection. Right. So actually the word compassion in the Latin means come with, passion, suffer, to suffer with. There's an inherent connectedness in the experience of compassion. So self-pity is, woe is me, poor me. Self-compassion is just recognizing, hey, everyone's imperfect. Everyone lives an imperfect life. Everyone struggles. It's not just me. And this sense of interconnection is really, really important because often what happens, especially when we're struggling because of something we did or a mistake we made, in that moment we kind of illogically feel as if everyone else is leading a perfect life and it's just me who's failed and it's just me who's made a mistake. And we forget that the human experience is all about imperfection. That's kind of what it means to be human. So we need to remember our interconnectedness in addition to being kind and mindful in moments of pain. So that's Neff's three-component model right there.
That's great. Thanks for laying that out. And actually, on the second component on the kindness that you were highlighting, I think that's something to me that is really notable in the sense that a lot of times it's very common for mindfulness, or it can happen where mindfulness is taught with kind of a clinical precision. And
Yes.
well, I'm an engineer by training. I kind of get that, but I think, you emphasize a lot of kindness and warmth, which
Yeah.
is really helpful. And maybe you can talk a little bit about, why we need both together.
Yeah, and so mindfulness, like I say, it's the foundation of self-compassion, but mindfulness has a slightly different aim than compassion. So mindfulness is always aimed at experience, right? Making space for our experience, opening to our experience, being aware of our experience in a non-judgmental, non-resistant manner. But compassion, the kind of warmth and kindness part of it, is actually aimed at the person who's having a painful experience, i.e. in this case, me, or if I had compassion for you, it'd be you. And so, it's not enough. I mean, well, it's a good start to be aware of pain and not resist it, because we know if we resist it, it makes things worse. But we also have to have care and concern for the person, the sentient being who is suffering. Right. So like, for instance, you can be mindful of the taste of a raisin if you've ever done the raisin eating exercise, but you're not going to have compassion for that raisin. Compassion always requires some sort of, sentient being, means some being who's awake and aware and has the experience of suffering in order to emerge. And so when pain is present, when there's somebody who is suffering, the natural response of the heart is concern for the alleviation of suffering. And that has a particular quality of warmth and care. So it's really important to have both. It's not just enough to accept our pain. We also need to do something about it, right? We have to take action to alleviate our pain, but we need to do it mindfully, because if we try to alleviate our pain by resisting it, it'll just make it worse. And that's where compassion comes in. So they kind of have an interesting relationship. They aren't exactly the same.
That's great. Thanks for kind of talking that through. And maybe you can talk a little bit about resilience.
So again, mindfulness is part of self-compassion. So I'll just talk about the research on self-compassion more generally, because I'm kind of including mindfulness in there and when I talk about it. But the research at this point is pretty overwhelming. My colleague Mark Leary says the research is getting really boring because it always shows the same thing, which is people who have more self-compassion or who are taught to be more self-compassionate have better outcomes, right? So there's well over, I think, 2,500 studies at this point. And that's based on a Google Scholar search of studies with self-compassion in the title, not even just including ones that look at it as an outcome measure. So there's a lot of research, and it pretty much always points in the same direction, which is better coping, better resilience, better well-being. So for instance, we know that self-compassion is linked to less psychopathology, right? Less depression, less anxiety, less stress, less eating disorders. It's linked to happier states of mind, like happiness and life satisfaction, hope, optimism. And part of the reason for that is because self-compassion is kind of an interesting state of mind because it's aimed at suffering. And yet the experience of compassion itself, of kindness, of connectedness, is actually a positive emotion. So in a way, when you're holding suffering in this particular way, you're generating a positive emotion, not to pretend that negative emotion isn't there, not to pretend that the pain doesn't exist, but you're holding the pain in this kind of loving, connected manner. So you're generating positive emotions alongside of the awareness of the negative emotion. And it seems to, first of all, provide a buffer against the negative effects of that negative experience, which can lead to things like depression or anxiety. And it also feels good to experience compassion and to feel connected with yourself. So it has this real alchemical ability to transform negative experiences into something that has positive outcomes in the long run. So that's really interesting, that whole body of research. There's also big research literature on, again, like you said, coping and resilience, which is interesting because a lot of people think that self-compassion is weak, that self-criticism makes them strong, I'm tough, I don't need self-compassion. Well, I mean, basically, you can sum up the research by saying that when the going gets tough, that they're better off being self-compassionate than being self-critical. Because just to give you an example, there's been a fair amount of research done with combat veterans. You know, there's work in the VA looking at soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So people who've really, met very difficult life circumstances. And they find that those veterans who are more self-compassionate about their experience, first of all, they're a lot less likely to develop post-traumatic stress syndrome, which can be the aftermath of experiencing combat. And get this, more important than how much combat they experienced was how self-compassionate they were toward that experience, right? In other words, it's not just what you face in life, it's how do you deal with what you face in life? Are you kind and supportive, or do you judge and do you shame yourself?
That impacted their PTSD outcomes.
Well, yeah, so it was actually a stronger predictor 9 months later of whether or not they developed PTSD than how much action they had seen overseas, right? It's also shown to reduce suicidal ideation, better functioning, right? And I like to use the combat soldier analogy because, in many ways, life is kind of like a war, right? We all have our own personal challenges and difficulties and confrontations. And, who do you want in your head when the going gets tough? Do you want a voice that's an enemy cutting you down, shaming you? Is that really going to help you be strong when you go into battle with life? Or do you want a voice that's an ally that's saying, hey, I got your back. I'm here to support you. I believe in you. Clearly having a kinder, encouraging, more supportive voice is going to make you stronger than one that's shaming or belittling. So lots of work on resilience, and it's not just combat. I mean, whether it's divorce, raising a special needs child, coping with cancer, you name it, self-compassion is a very, very potent and powerful source of coping and resilience.
It's great. And actually, along the lines of kind of, you were talking about the tough get going, or the tough, are more successful with self-compassion. I've heard also there's some concerns that people have about, achievement and motivation, and not being able to, if you need to be hard on yourself to be able to achieve in life and strive, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit as well.
Right. Yeah, that's another major myth or misconception, that self-compassion is going to undermine your motivation, that you're just going to be like, oh, I'm going to be kind to myself. I don't need to go to work, or I don't need to get that degree. This is good enough. And again, that's a complete fallacy. What the research shows is that self-compassion not only enhances our motivation, but gives us the grit and what we need to sustain our motivation over time. So a lot of people get confused, I think, between constructive criticism and harsh self-criticism. So self-compassion includes constructive criticism. Self-compassion clearly says, this isn't working for you. You need to make a change, right? Or this is not a healthy behavior. So self-compassion motivates change, but from a place of care and concern, not from a place of shame or feelings of inadequacy, right? It's easy to see when we think about motivating our children. We can motivate our children with shame and criticism, saying, you better come home with an A, or else I'll hate you, or I'll ground you, or whatever. And we know that kind of works in the short term, but in the long term, it backfires. It actually undermines children's motivation. It's the same thing with ourselves, right? So self-criticism, you may have gotten through med school based on your self-criticism, but how would you have performed if you had done it out of a sense of care and compassion instead? You would probably be less stressed and anxiety prone, and you may even have done better on your tests because you weren't undermining your performance by all the anxiety you created. So again, the research is very clear that when people are self-compassionate, they still have high goals for themselves. And if you care about yourself, you're going to want to achieve your goals, and you're going to want to change unhealthy behaviors. But again, you do it because you care. You do it just like a good supportive coach would motivate you to make a change and not shame you into making a change. And so it lasts longer, and you're more able to recover from failure, to pick yourself up and try again. And again, to keep trying even when things are difficult.
That's great. And yeah, it's interesting, I think, addressing those myths. And maybe we can shift to talk a little bit about, kind of practicing self-compassion and what would be, maybe you can talk about some of the challenges people have as they're trying to practice self-compassion with themselves and how to address them.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, one of the major blocks to self-compassion are these myths that our culture gives us, that it's going to make you weak, it's going to undermine your motivation, it'll make you self-indulgent or selfish, right? These cultural blocks really stand in the way of people being able to trust being self-compassionate. They think, that it's kind of, we have a fear reaction, like, if I'm kind to myself, I'll fall apart. And so one of the things to help you practice self-compassion is learning a little bit about the research and that it shows actually it's not going to do that. It's actually going to be healthy for you. So that's one block. There's some other challenges to practicing self-compassion. So, many of us, the way we've gotten through life, maybe through if we had a difficult childhood or we've just faced some trauma or stress, we've kind of gotten through life by closing down our hearts. And when we start opening our hearts, it can be a little frightening, right, to try something new. And also sometimes what happens is we start opening our hearts and kind of the kindness comes in and the old pain comes out. And people think, oh my God, this is too scary, or I'm doing it wrong. And so it's important to know that when you first start practicing self-compassion, some difficult stuff can come up as you start to open your heart. Really the only way out is through. You need to be able to open your heart in order to have a better relationship with yourself and others. But you need to start practicing slowly. You have to be self-compassionate in the way that you practice self-compassion. You don't want to bully yourself into being in this new way of relationship with yourself. But really, so once you kind of get over some of those hurdles of the myths, or actually what we call that negative reaction to practicing self-compassion, we call it backdraft. It's like when you open the doors of a house on fire and the air rushes in and the flames rush out. That can happen with self-compassion. But once you know that, and okay, that just means I need to slow down. Once you get over those bumps, it's actually a lot easier than you think to practice self-compassion. That's because it's doing what you already know how to do, and that's to be a good friend, right? So most of us have experience of how to support others. Maybe our child comes to us, or a good friend, or our partner, and they're upset. We know how to be kind and supportive. We know how to use our tone of voice to convey the fact that we care. We know how to be encouraging in kind of a positive way as opposed to a shaming way. We may not always be this way, but we have some experience with that. So all we really need to do is make a U-turn and treat ourselves the way we're used to treating others, right? And you can even just quite simply say, God, how would I treat my child or someone, my really good friend? How would I treat this person if they were going through the same thing I was going through? And chances are you would treat them a lot better than you normally treat yourself. So you can use that as a template. Okay, here's what I would say to my friend. Well, then you can try saying that to yourself. Here's the tone of voice I would use with my child. Okay, you can try using that tone of voice with yourself. We already have the skill to be compassionate. We just have to give ourselves permission to use it with ourselves. So that's, kind of the easy part. And then there's other things we can do, again, that we do naturally for others, like using touch. Touch is an amazing way to communicate compassion to ourselves because our bodies respond to touch almost automatically. I mean, if you think about it, babies for the first 2 years of life, they don't have language. The primary way that care is communicated between parents and the child is through touch. So our bodies respond to warm touch by the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated, meaning we start to calm down, we relax, our heart rate becomes more variable, our cortisol goes down, all through touch. And the body doesn't really know the difference between touch from others and touch from ourselves. It's still, especially if it's done with a caring intent. If you put your hands on your heart or your face or hold your hand or something very simple like that, you can actually calm down your physiology, helps you feel more safe, And then that sets the stage for a more compassionate approach. It's really not rocket science. It's just doing what we naturally do for others toward ourselves.
It's great. And maybe you could talk about, like, if you're right in the midst of a challenge and you find yourself beating yourself up, like, maybe a couple steps, some tips on what you would do right at that moment.
Yeah, so, and I can also teach a practice if you want in a little bit, but so the first thing we need to do is be mindful. So mindfulness, like you say, is kind of the foundation of self-compassion. So as you say, when you catch yourself beating yourself up, that's mindfulness. So just noticing, okay, how am I relating to myself right now? Am I being kind and supportive and positive, or am I being harsh and critical, right? And what's the effect of this on me? And so that's kind of using your mindfulness to notice what's happening and the pain that's there. And then you need to kind of connect with the pain of that. Wow, oof, that really hurt when I told myself that mean thing. Okay, so you can connect with that. And then once you've connected with the pain of what's happening, you can say, well, what is it that I need right now? What is it that I need to support myself in this moment? And that might be, again, some words of kind of what I like to call yin self-compassion, which is more being with ourselves in a kind way, comforting ourselves, soothing ourselves, reassuring ourselves that we aren't alone. Sometimes what we need is what I like to call the yang of self-compassion. That means we may need to take action. Maybe what we need is to do something, to make a change, or to protect ourselves, to say no, take action in the world to alleviate our suffering. But compassion always asks the question, what do I need? How can I support myself in this moment? And then so you do that. And then again, always framing the whole thing in the context of interdependence, right? Or common humanity. It's not just me, everyone goes through this, and the way I relate to myself will impact how I relate to others, just as the way I relate to others impacts how I relate to myself. I mean, we're just a small piece of this larger cloth. And that framing it in the bigger picture gives us really wisdom and a sense of perspective. So we aren't just like, thinking this is the worst thing that ever happened in the world, when in fact, maybe it's not the end of the world, in the bigger scheme of things. And so really that wisdom, the kindness and the mindfulness is just bringing those three things. And you can do it intentionally in kind of a step format, bring in mindfulness, then kindness, and with the wisdom of common humanity to help support you in that moment.
It's great. And, speaking about kind of the thoughts of interdependence and then how we relate to others.
Yes.
You talk about kind of how having self-compassion to yourself impacts your capacity to connect and have relationship with others.
Yeah, and so it's an interesting thing about the relationship between self-compassion and compassion for others. So sometimes you may have heard people say you can't be compassionate to others until you have self-compassion. That's actually not true, and empirically that's not the case. In fact, most people are pretty compassionate to others and not compassionate to themselves. And so if you just look at a simple correlation between the two, it's actually not that strong, because so many people are, you probably know people like this, they're kind, right, lovely, giving people to others and not to themselves. And so it's not like it's a necessary precursor, but what is true is that if you don't have compassion for yourself, you will burn out. Right? So if you just give and give and give and treat yourself horribly, you'll get exhausted, you'll get anxious, you may break down in a depression, which is going to limit your ability to keep giving to others. So you might say self-compassion is necessary to sustain compassion for others. And also, we do know that once you have more self-compassion, it does help you to be more forgiving of others, right? You're less ego defensive. If you can kind of forgive yourself for your own mistakes, you can more easily forgive others. It creates more perspective taking. So self-compassion is very helpful in sustaining relationships with others. It leads to better relationships with others. We know that from the research, but it's not absolutely necessary to have compassion for others, because that's the way most people are, kind to others, not to themselves.
Yes, no, it's great. And I think that's a great way of characterizing it, that it really allows for kind of sustained relationship.
Sustained, yeah, yeah. And so we did one study with couples, for instance, and people who had self-compassionate partners, they described their partners as being much more caring, much more giving in the relationship, and they were happier with self-compassionate partners, right? And so in other words, when you meet some of your own needs, you actually have more to give to others. So that's another way you can sustain good relationships better over time.
It's funny, now I understand why my colleagues were recommending that I take the mindful self-compassion.
And you like it, huh? Yeah.
But that's great. And you know, you were mentioning leading a practice. Actually, that would be wonderful. I think
Yeah.
maybe we can close with the practice. And
Okay.
I just want to say, you know, thank you so much, Kristin. It was great to hear you kind of walk through the science as well as the experience, and now to lead a practice would just be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to lead a practice called the self-compassion break, which really draws on the 3-component model of self-compassion. So we're going to use language to help us evoke a sense of mindfulness about something we're experiencing, to remember common humanity, and then to bring ourselves kindness, not only verbally, but also through some touch. So I'm going to go ahead and close my eyes when I lead this practice because it's hard for me to do it with my eyes open. If you're watching, you may want to do that as well. Right? You don't have to, but it often helps to go inward. Maybe just take a few breaths to release all the talking we've been doing. Okay, so I'd invite you to think of a situation, a current situation in your life right now that's causing you some stress or struggle, some difficulty. Okay, and please don't choose something that's traumatic or very difficult, because if you're kind of overwhelmed by the stress of it, you won't really be able to focus. So something that's mild to moderately difficult. This could be something that you're experiencing in your life, a health issue, a relationship issue, a work issue, or maybe something that you're feeling badly about, some mistake you made or something you did that you regret in some way. Okay, so just take a moment to think of the situation that feels right to work with right now. We often have many, so choose wisely. Okay, and just bring the situation to mind. Know who's involved, if there are people involved, what's happening, or maybe what are you afraid might happen. So let yourself really get in touch with the situation and the feelings being evoked. And so I'm going to be saying some phrases that bring in the 3 components of self-compassion. But what I'd like you to do is to find language that works for you, that makes sense to you personally. Okay. So the first phrase is, this is a moment of suffering. Okay, so what you're going through, suffering is present. This is mindfulness. We're bringing mindful awareness to the fact that this is really hard. And so you may want to see what language conveys that to yourself. Maybe something like, this really hurts, or I'm just so frustrated right now, or I feel so badly. Whatever language really lets you know, holds and validates the pain you're experiencing right now. This hurts. And then we want to bring in recognition of our humanity in this, you know, suffering, pain, difficulty. This is part of life. All right, remembering it's not just me. Many people are struggling in a similar way. Maybe the situations are different, but everyone struggles. This is normal, it's human. Right, and again, any language that really conveys that to you. Okay, and then we want to bring in the kindness. So the first way we're going to do that is by using some sort of touch that feels caring and supportive. So it might be putting both hands on your heart, or maybe cradling your face, even giving yourself a hug, right? Or just holding your hand. Using some form of touch to let your body know that you care, that you're here to support yourself. And then bringing in some language of kindness, right? The type of thing that you might say to a dear friend who is experiencing the exact same situation you're experiencing right now. Right? What would you say to that friend? What would your tone of voice be? Can you say that to yourself? Okay, and then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Okay, so yeah, that's the self-compassion break. And that's something you can do at any time. I let it quite slowly, but you can just, you know, do it quickly in the moment, like, this is really hard right now. It's okay, it happens, you know, what do I need right now? You can do very quickly, or you can do it in a more prolonged manner. And also just to say, remember, some people may be experiencing a bit of backdraft right now. Sometimes when we open our heart even just a little bit, we don't necessarily feel good and warm and squishy. Sometimes what we do when we do that is more pain arises. Doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, it means you're doing it right, but that you just may need to go a little slowly and allow the practice to unfold naturally. It does happen over time.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Kristin.
You're welcome. You're welcome.